Lesson 12, Ladders. In our last lesson, we learned about ladder breakers. At the end of that previous lesson, I introduced two different methods for reading ladder breakers. In this lesson, I will explain the pros and cons of these two methods in detail and discuss which method is more suitable for specific board positions. For example, after a ladder shape is formed here in the bottom right corner, let's place a random white stone on the left. Now, black plays Atari, forming a ladder. Usually, if there is a single white stone on the left, we extend a line from this stone toward the bottom right. This makes it relatively easy and fast to see if the ladder works. Alright, we can see that when white extends here, it actually doesn't help with the ladder at all. Black's Atari follows this line, so this position cannot act as a ladder breaker. Okay, now let's move this stone to this position. Black plays Atari, and we quickly project this stone upwards. It should be right here along this line. Now the ladder becomes unfavorable for black. So, by using this method, we can very quickly judge whether the ladder is favorable for black or not. However, please note that when the stone is located on the second line, this method no longer applies. As I just mentioned, if we project this stone forward along this line, moving this stone from the third line to the second line seems to have no impact at all. For instance, if we draw the line to this point, black still can't capture white in the ladder. This line drawn from the second line is correct. But if we use black's perspective, the second method, I taught in the last lesson, projecting black's line, will yield a different result. Let's do a demonstration. Black has two possible lines, this one here and this one over here. Since this top left stone is further left, we follow the left line. Black's path comes across like this. Alright, as I place it here, I wonder if you players have already noticed something different about this situation. Black's Atari comes from this side. This means when the sequence reaches here, black plays Atari, white runs. Black plays Atari, white runs. Black plays Atari, white runs. Notice that when black gives Atari here, black can continue to Atari downwards. Instead of playing Atari on the first line, the direction of the Atari changes here, but black can still capture white in the ladder. This is a special shape. Well, explaining it like this might be a bit confusing to understand. So let's demonstrate it on the board. If we use the first method as we just tried, the ladder is unfavorable. But let's look at the results of the demonstration. It is quite long. The ladder sequence is very long. If you try to read it out move by move like this, it will be very exhausting. That is why we need two methods for reading. The first method is to project the white stone toward black's ladder direction. This works well when there is only one stone in the top left, making it easy to project. Right? Earlier, projecting the white stone showed an unfavorable ladder. But remember the exception I mentioned. When the stone is on the second line, we must use the second method and project black stones upwards. Why? Because a situation like this will occur. Black no longer plays Atari from this side. Black can Atari downwards. Pay attention to the second or third line positions. We just need to read this out. Always watch out for black's option to play an Atari downwards. Capturing white, right here. This is what we learned before, using a downward Atari and the edge of the board to capture the opponent. Therefore, when reading ladders, we must be very careful about this downward Atari shape. If your stone is not on the second or third line, simply projecting the white stone upwards is an easier method. But if your white ladder breaker is on the second or third line, you need to be careful. The simplest and safest approach, or rather, the safest approach, is to project black's shape upwards to see if the ladder is favorable. Of course, besides this scenario, there is another situation. For example, let me add a few more stones at the top. Alright, suppose I create a shape like this. Now, if black plays Atari here, can black capture the white stones? With a messy shape in the top left where there are many stones, it is very difficult to project this shape downwards. So when encountering a shape like this, our only option is to project black stones upwards. We still use my method, and we can project it upwards from both sides like this. For instance, with this black stone, we can map out a general logical path, projecting it upwards on this side too. Okay, you can actually visualize this shape forming in your mind as you project it all the way up. Just by looking at the shape, the Atari is here. White runs, black plays Atari. If you practice enough, projecting just one side is actually enough. When you project it right to this point, white runs, black plays Atari. White runs, black plays Atari. White runs, black plays Atari. White connects, and black forms a closing in capture. Alright, let's demonstrate this sequence. Suppose white runs now. Black plays Atari. The sequence is quite long, but our method works perfectly. Playing Atari here forms a smothering capture, a closing in capture, which is essentially a combination of smothering and an engulfing Atari. Calling it a closing in capture is also correct. These types of terms often share very similar meanings. Alright, this is the smothering capture we learned in the last lesson. So it works. Black captures white in the ladder. So this is why I said we need to learn both methods. When there is a single white stone in the top left, projecting it upwards makes it easy to judge. Except for that special case. Of course, for stones on the second or third line, we must watch out for black's ability to Atari downwards. And in situations like this with many stones, we need to project black stones upwards to see if the ladder is favorable. Finally, let's learn another very important technique used in ladders. Alright, let me modify the board shape once again. Okay, let's look at this shape. Now, after white runs out from the bottom right corner, can black capture white in a ladder? This final technique involves changing the direction of the ladder by using arteries. When we encounter a shape like this, where the ladder can go in various directions, we also need to use the method of projecting black stones upwards to read it. I added 3 stones in the bottom right, which means black now needs to capture these 2 white stones. Let's ignore sacrificing stones after an Atari and net. The question is simply whether black can capture these 2 white stones. If we use black's projection method to read this, we can first consider playing Atari from this position. Of course, if you are already quite skilled at ladders, you'll notice this is clearly facing the stones. So we would naturally calculate, if I play one more Atari, does the ladder work? If we play the ladder this way, since it is closer to the center, the most likely logical path to read is playing Atari toward the right. I am not sure if everyone can understand this. But let's calculate this one. This seems the most likely because it is the furthest away, the furthest among the 6 lines. If you project the position of this stone upwards, it looks like the ladder fails. But as I mentioned, for a stone on the 3rd line, we also need to be careful that black might be able to Atari downwards. So we should try to project black stones upwards, right? Project black upwards like this, right, to this position. Okay, so what does this mean? It means when the Atari is here, white runs, black plays Atari, 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 and continuing the Atari forms a downward Atari. Let's try it out. When we look here, it becomes very clear. Black can play an Atari downwards, and white is captured. Alright, so this final shape tells us that when black is playing a ladder, there might be multiple ladder choices available. That is, black can change the direction of the ladder through different arteries. There are even some extreme examples where during the process of the ladder, you can still change the direction of the stones. For example, let's look at another extreme case. If I move this white stone 1 space to the right, normally the ladder wouldn't work anymore, right? Because we just went through this ladder sequence. However, I've now added another black stone to this position. Okay, so how should we read this ladder now? We can still use the method we just discussed. If we play the ladder directly like this, it is clearly on the line. So we still think about after the Atari, right? If playing this way is still on the line, we should obviously try to Atari towards the right. But notice that this stone is on the ladder's path, so it might actually help when we project upwards here. We need to make use of this stone. So we can project black to this position. The Atari is here, white runs here. Black plays Atari, and white runs. Alright, notice that at this moment, 2 Atari directions appear again. Why? Because of this stone. Without it, black could only Atari from here. Now, with this stone present, black has an additional Atari direction from this position, right? Well then, if I play Atari from this position, I shift him one line over. He runs, and I Atari again. If we read it out this way, the downward Atari shape appears once again. Alright, let's test it out on the board. At this point, black plays Atari. Right. Without this stone, I could only Atari from here. But even playing Atari from here, the stones can actually still be captured in the ladder, just by adding this extra downward Atari. Okay, similarly, notice that at this position, I can also choose to play Atari directly from this side. In short, the presence of this stone gives me an extra choice for the direction of my Atari. Therefore, the final important aspect of ladders is to pay attention to changing the ladder's direction through continuous Ataris. Notice how right here in the middle, we change the direction of the ladder and ultimately we can still capture white. That concludes the explanation of all the ladder techniques. Becoming proficient at ladders relies entirely on accumulating experience. Alright, thank you all for watching. That is all for today's content.